What if the most ancient genetic bridge between Africa, Arabia and Eurasia has been hiding in Yemen all along, and not a single textbook mentioned it? Not Egypt, not Mesopotamia, not even the Levant. In early 2025, a landmark genetic study shattered the geographic bias of ancient history. Published in Scientific Reports, DOI 10.038/S41598-024-81615-4, it analysed 46 full Yemeni genomes and 169 genotype arrays, comparing them to global datasets, and what it revealed was nothing short of revolutionary. Nearly 1/3 of Yemen's maternal lineages belong to deep-rooted sub-Saharan African haplogroups, including L2A1 and L3, lineages that trace back tens of thousands of years to East Africa. Yet at the same time, the paternal side tells a completely different story. Over 59% of Yemeni men carry haplogroup J1A, a signature of Semitic-speaking peoples, found widely across the Levant and Arabian Peninsula and peaking in Yemen itself. This isn't just a split, it's a code, a genetic fingerprint left by two different streams of history, one maternal, African, and often invisible in written records, the other paternal, Arabian and tied to dynasties, kingdoms and conquests. The contradiction is stunning, and yet it's not chaos, it's clarity. Around 5,220 years ago, genetic evidence shows a major influx from Bronze Age Palestine, likely tied to early Levantine traders, priests and pastoralists. Then, roughly 750 years ago, African maternal gene flow resurged, not through free migration, but through the shadowed corridors of the Red Sea slave trade. Why do these maternal haplogroups persist so clearly today? Because under Islamic law, children of enslaved African women were legally free, and over generations they became Yemeni by blood and name. Their story was erased from memory, but not from DNA. So what does this make Yemen? Not a migration route, not a cultural backwater, but a genetic crucible, where Africa meets Arabia, where the first footsteps of humanity left echoes, and where identity was never simple, but always sacred. But within one of these African lineages, scientists found something no one was prepared for, a mitochondrial branch that exists nowhere else on Earth. Not in Ethiopia, not in Egypt, not in sub-Saharan Africa. A genome that shouldn't exist, and yet it does. It's called L6, and it just rewrote the story of human origins. One Yemeni mitochondrial lineage doesn't appear anywhere in Africa. It's not in Ethiopia, not even in Egypt. It's alone. In 2025, when scientists sequence full mitochondrial genomes from Yemeni populations, they expected overlap. They expected East African connections, perhaps even Nubian or Ethiopian echoes. But instead they found something that defied genetic logic. A lineage, unmatched, untethered, unnamed for decades. Haplogroup L6. It looks African. It should be African, but across thousands of African genome samples from Sudan to Tanzania to Congo, there's nothing, no direct match, no ancestral cluster. As if Yemen had incubated this genome in isolation for tens of thousands of years. This isn't a rare variant. In Yemen, L6 is the most frequent maternal haplogroup. But outside of Yemen, it's a ghost lineage, yes, but not in the fantastical sense, in the genetic sense. A deeply rooted maternal branch, cut off from the African trunk, diverging in a forgotten corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and surviving. How? The answer may lie more than 20,000 years ago, during one of the humid, Green Arabia phases. When climate shifts turned desert into grassland, when early humans could settle, stay, and evolve apart. It's possible L6 diverged right there, not as an immigrant, but as a daughter of the soil. A separate maternal experiment in human history. And then came the empires, the traders, the conquerors, the slaves. But somehow, this one maternal signature survived, passed from mother to daughter through centuries of upheaval, from the Axumite invasions, through the Red Sea slave trade, through the Islamic dynasties of the 10th century. Empires fell, languages changed, but L6 stayed. No kings carried it, no monuments were carved for it, but the women did. They bore it in silence, through war, displacement, famine, encoding it not in storybooks, but in mitochondria. It is a genetic monument, one you can't see unless you know where to look. But while maternal DNA tells a story of African roots and hidden resilience, Yemen's paternal genome tells a story of kings. Semitic empires, Arabian warriors, tribal expansions written not in myth, but in Y chromosomes. And that contrast, that tension, reveals something even deeper about who Yemenis really are. What if the Arab world didn't just spread from Yemen, but started there? You heard that right. For generations we were told that the Arab tribes descended from the north, from the Levant, from ancient Mesopotamia, from the great deserts of Central Arabia. But Yemen's DNA tells a different story, a louder one, a bloodline that predates the script. In 2023, when population geneticists mapped the Y chromosome haplogroup J1A across the Middle East, they expected the highest concentrations in northern Arabia, maybe even Damascus. But they were wrong. The highest signal was in Yemen. Over 59% of Yemeni men carry J1A, the same paternal marker found in the ancient Levantine kingdoms, in Semitic-speaking populations, and even in biblical tribes. But here, in Yemen, the lineage is older, deeper, rooted, not an echo, the origin. This changes everything, because the rise of ancient South Arabian kingdoms, like the Sabaeans, Qatabanians and Himyarites, wasn't just a regional event. It was a civilizational pulse. The Sabaeans built temples of stone, mapped the stars, traded frankincense to Rome and gold to Persia. And their men, their kings, carried this genetic code. This wasn't the outpost of Arabia, it was its heart. Now pair that with what we know from maternal lines, women from African origins brought across the Red Sea in waves, not as queens, as slaves, or captives, or survivors. The result, a people born from royalty and ruin, a country where men's DNA carries the legacy of Semitic rulers, and women's DNA remembers forgotten African mothers. One came by conquest, the other by survival. Both shaped what Yemen became. And the question rises again, why here? Why did this pattern repeat in Yemen and not elsewhere? Was it trade, climate, geography, or was there something far older pulling people into this land? Because thousands of years before genetics, before kings, before names, this place was already alive. Not dry, not empty, but green, wet, alive. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the desert. This place was once a green corridor, where hippos roamed and humans escaped extinction. We think of Arabia as endless sand, a furnace of stone and silence. But that's a lie of the present, because long before the dunes, this land was a lifeline. Welcome to Green Arabia. Between 130,000 and 55,000 years ago, Earth's orbit shifted. The monsoon belt surged north, and the Arabian Peninsula, including modern-day Yemen, bloomed. Rivers carved valleys, lakes filled basins, the desert turned to grass, and life exploded. Paleoclimate evidence from ancient lake beds in Wadi Hadramaut and cave pollen samples from the Dhofar highlands confirms that this region once held savannas, forests, and grazing megafauna, including elephants, crocodiles, even hippos, and humans followed. Geneticists now believe the earliest successful human migration out of Africa didn't happen through the Sinai, but through Yemen via the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Back then, sea levels were 70 metres lower. The distance between Djibouti and Yemen, just 20 kilometres, a walkable bridge or a crossable sea. Archaeologists at Shibat Dihya 1 in western Yemen unearthed Middle Paleolithic tools dated to approximately 55,000 years before present, almost identical to East African styles. These weren't nomads, these were pioneers, carving stone, building fire, following antelope herds and tidal coasts towards something unknown. And it didn't stop here. These early humans, carriers of mitochondrial haplogroups M and N, spread across Arabia into India, Southeast Asia and beyond. Nearly all non-African people today descend from those who passed through this forgotten corridor. So what does it mean? It means Yemen wasn't just a crossing. It was a cradle, a resting place, a beginning. How many migrations started here? How many ancestors stepped onto this soil before stepping into history? We've always asked, where did we begin? Maybe the answer was here all along. But thousands of years later, this very same route would run in reverse. And it wouldn't be a hopeful journey. It wouldn't be chosen. It would be a forced crossing, one that left scars still written in Yemeni DNA today. What if Yemen's African legacy wasn't just ancient, but medieval and heartbreaking? The same waters that once offered life now carried chains. Around the 13th to 15th centuries, a new tide surged across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But this time, it wasn't migration. It wasn't survival. It was captivity. Through the medieval Red Sea slave trade, thousands of East African women, Oromo, Bantu, Nubian, were taken from the Horn of Africa and brought to southern Arabia. Most left no names, no graves, no monuments, but they left one thing behind: DNA, mitochondrial haplogroups. L201, L3b, L3e, all distinctively East African, appear across Yemeni maternal lines today. And they don't date back to Paleolithic crossings. They cluster sharply around 700 to 900 years ago, mirroring exactly the documented rise in Arab Axumite conflict, coastal piracy, and demand for domestic labour in Islamic city-states along the Red Sea. And here's the twist history forgot. Under Islamic jurisprudence, the child of an enslaved woman was legally free, which meant over generations African maternal ancestry flowed silently into the Yemeni gene pool, even as male lineages stayed Arabian and Semitic. So we see it now. A society where the father's name built a tribe, and the mother's DNA built a future. A quiet inheritance passed through songs, skin, silence, until science finally made it visible. But it wasn't just biology. It shaped identity. Into the 20th century, many Yemeni families were still divided by these invisible histories, marked by skin tone, speech, or social class. Some called it akdam, a word tied to service. Others called it heritage, but no one could deny it was real. This wasn't just a demographic shift, it was memory, buried in blood. But what if this African thread wasn't always tied to chains? What if, centuries before this trade, Yemen wasn't the captor, but the conquered? What if an African empire once ruled Yemen and changed its bloodline forever? An African empire once ruled Arabia, and its legacy is buried in Yemeni DNA. We often imagine the Red Sea as a border, but during the rise of one of Africa's greatest forgotten civilizations, it was a bridge. The Aksumite Empire, thriving between 100 CE and 600 CE in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was no tribal kingdom. It had a written script, minted coins in its own name, sent emissaries to Rome and Byzantium, and built stone obelisks that pierced the sky. And around c. 520 CE, it crossed the sea. Under King Caleb of Aksum, a massive naval expedition landed in Yemen to crush the Himyarite king Du Nuwas, a Jewish monarch accused of massacring Christians. With the support of Byzantium and in the name of faith, but driven also by control of spice trade routes, the Aksumites conquered western Yemen, including Zafar, Najran, and coastal ports. They didn't just invade, they ruled. Coins discovered in Yemeni archaeological layers bear the names of Aksumite rulers, Ela Azbeha, Wazena, while inscriptions in Ge'ez script appear in ancient sanctuaries. Temples were remodeled, African-style Christian churches were built, and East African cultural motifs began to appear in local Yemeni art and architecture. But the deeper evidence is in the genome. Recent autosomal admixture models, published 2022 Nature Communications, show a non-Arab East African component in highland Yemeni populations that predates the Islamic era, not traceable to the Red Sea slave trade, but to earlier African contact. This aligns precisely with the Aksumite period. Maternal haplogroups like L3X1, rare even in Africa, show up in Yemeni populations, suggesting intermarriage, settlement, and more than just political occupation. This wasn't a passing invasion, it was a genetic and cultural fusion, a rare moment when Africa didn't just respond to Arabia, it shaped it. Yemen's identity wasn't merely influenced by Africa, it was, for a time, African ruled. But long before Aksum ever set sail, Yemen had already been transformed by traders, kings and migrants, not from Africa, but from the north, from the oldest cities of the Levant and the shadow of Mesopotamia. For 3,000 years, a tree resin built empires and rewrote the genetic code of Yemen. Before oil, before borders, before maps, Yemen was wealth, not because of gold, but because of scent. From the dry bark of a desert tree, Boswellia sacra, oozed a resin so rare, so sacred, that it moved gods and emperors, frankincense. For over 3 millennia it poured out of Yemen's highlands and into the burning lungs of temples in Thebes, Jerusalem, and Rome. But this wasn't just about trade, it was a movement of blood. The incense route, running from Shabwa through Marib and into Petra, wasn't a line on a map, it was a genetic artery. Along it came not only camels and spices, but Levantine merchants, Egyptian priests, Persian riders, and Indian sailors. And in the burials of Barakish, the ancient Katabanian capital, archaeologists found something striking. Non-local cranial types, grave inscriptions in multiple scripts, and foreign ceramics, suggesting intermarriage, settlement, and cultural fusion, not just trade stops. Genetically, the story is even clearer. A 2021 genomic analysis published in Cell revealed a major gene flow from Bronze Age Palestine to Yemen around 5,200 years ago. This was no trickle, it was a surge tied to the explosion of incense trade that funded temples, cities, and armies from Mesopotamia to the Nile Delta. This is why ancient Yemen was not tribal. It was urban, cosmopolitan, multilingual. Its mothers may have been local, but its fathers came from afar, from Byblos, from from Dilmun. So the next time you picture a Roman emperor burning incense, know this: that smoke carried not just scent, but ancestry, Yemeni blood, Levantine fingerprints, and the DNA of children born far from home. But beneath all that wealth, under the cities, trade routes, and temples, there's something even older buried in Yemen's mountains. Something untouched by empire or script. The trail left by the very first humans to leave Africa. What if the first humans to leave Africa didn't go north through Egypt, but east through Yemen? For decades, we imagined humanity's great departure as a march through the Sinai, a northern arc into the Levant. But new science and ancient stone tell a different story. Not a bridge of stone temples, but a narrow slit of sea. Not through Pharaoh's lands, but through the forgotten shorelines of Yemen. The southern dispersal route theory, once controversial, is now reshaping everything we thought we knew about how Homo sapiens colonized the world. Between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels dropped, and the Bab el Mandeb Strait shrank to just 20 kilometres, in some places shallow enough to wade, and across that strip of water they came, small bands, families, firemakers, tool carriers, guided by stars and survival. They walked off the African continent and into Arabia. In Shibat Diyar 1, a rock shelter tucked into Yemen's western highlands, archaeologists discovered Middle Paleolithic stone tools, dated to around 55,000 years ago. Tools that match East African patterns, but also show innovation, hybrid forms, blades shaped for a new world. These were not aimless wanderers. These were the first great risk-takers of our species, and the proof isn't just in the rocks, it's in us. The mitochondrial DNA, haplogroups M and N, now found across every corner of Eurasia, from Scandinavia to the Indian subcontinent, trace their origin not through the Nile, but through this southern corridor. And if that's true, then Yemen is not just a waypoint. It's the cradle of the global diaspora, the launchpad of civilization's first exhale. Imagine that, the first footsteps into the unknown, printed in Yemeni mud. But while many moved on, some didn't. Some stayed. And their descendants there still walk these mountains, carrying the most ancient DNA found in Arabia, untouched by empire, unchanged by time. A forgotten island, a medieval genome, and a lineage that defies all logic. In a world shaped by conquest, migration, and collapse, one island stayed still. Socotra, a crag of limestone and dragon's blood trees floating in the Arabian Sea, long cut off by storms, currents, and superstition. But inside its people, a secret long hidden from history. In 2024, a groundbreaking genome study led by Sirac et al., using high-coverage sequencing of Socotri villagers, revealed something astonishing. 86% of their DNA matched Hadramaut Yemenis, 14% showed Iranian ancestry. But here's the shocker: 0% sub-Saharan African input. None. This stands in complete contrast to mainland Yemen, where maternal haplogroups L, 2A and L3, legacies of African lineage and slave trade, are deeply embedded. Socotra, meanwhile, resisted the genetic tide for over 1,000 years, and it goes deeper still. When their DNA was compared to ancient samples, the Socotri genome aligned more closely with Natufian hunter-gatherers from the Levant approximately 12,000 years ago, rather than with the later Neolithic farmers who transformed the Middle East. This means the islanders' ancestry holds a Paleolithic echo, preserved across time, unaltered by agriculture, untouched by empire. That's not just isolation, that's time frozen. And while their genes stayed still, so did their stories. Socotra's oral poetry, pre-Islamic rituals and language forms hold relics of ancient maritime routes. Their dialect contains South Arabian linguistic fossils, and their legends speak of ships blown off course by gods, not currents. This wasn't just an island, it was a living museum of ancient Arabia, a place where Stone Age DNA survived into the satellite age. But even here, even on this wind-scraped island, Yemen's genome still whispers something stranger, something older than memory, something that doesn't come from any modern human, because it is buried in Yemen's DNA, is an echo that doesn't belong to Homo sapiens, a genetic ghost from another species, still alive in the people of the desert. What if Yemen's blood carries a species that no fossil has ever revealed? Not all ancestors leave bones. Some leave whispers. In recent years, geneticists have discovered something eerie hidden in the genomes of modern people. Ghost lineages. These are archaic humans that left no skulls, no tools, no teeth, just fragments of code woven into our cells. And in Yemen, that whisper is louder than expected. Unlike sub-Saharan Africa, which carries mystery archaic DNA unique to its populations, Yemen holds a different trace. Neanderthal alleles, present at levels comparable to those found in Southwest Asia and Europe. These alleles aren't from local admixture, they're inherited, passed down from a wave of humans who encountered Neanderthals somewhere between the Levant and Western Arabia, likely around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. But here's where it gets complicated. Some headlines scream about a ghost species in Arabia. That Yemenis might be part something else, but that's not the real story. There's no secret cousin species hiding in the Hadramaut, no undiscovered branch of humanity rising from the desert. Instead, what we find is more powerful, a genetic mosaic. Yemen's blood is a record of every traveller, every exile, every orphaned lineage, preserved, layered, never erased. When researchers from Prufa et al. 2021 examined Neanderthal introgress DNA, they found that Arabian genomes, especially from southern tribes, retain some of the oldest, least diluted traces of that ancient contact. It's not a ghost, it's a fossil, encoded in flesh. And maybe that's what makes Yemen different. It doesn't discard the forgotten, it holds them, in stone, in song, in the smallest strand of DNA. So what does it mean to be Yemeni today? What kind of identity is shaped by migrations, myths, and molecules? Because this story isn't over. It's only now, entering its most human chapter. DNA doesn't just record history, it records survival. If Yemen is a genetic archive, then it's one written in blood, burned scrolls, and broken silence. In the 21st century, even as we map the genome, Yemen bleeds. From war, from famine, from forgotten borders drawn by colonial hands. But beneath that trauma, something older endures, something no bullet can erase. When researchers analysed the genetic structure of Yemen in 2023, Schreiner et al., they found more than diversity. They found layers, fossils of migrations. Tribes in the highlands, like Almawit and Dama, retain dominant Arabian and Levantine autosomal profiles. Meanwhile, coastal communities in Al Hudaydah and Aden reveal stronger African admixture, particularly in mitochondrial haplogroups like L2A and L3 tied to East African lineages. But these aren't just numbers, these are inherited silences. Every skin tone variation, every tribal name, every whispered story of origin, they echo thousands of years of power, trade, war, and survival. Some families recall Arab ancestors who rode camels from Hejaz. Others remember grandmothers stolen from Nubian coasts. Both truths live in the same genome, side by side, unresolved. To be Yemeni is to hold two worlds in one breath: the conqueror and the conquered, the merchant and the enslaved, the pilgrim and the prisoner. Yet somehow, that contradiction didn't collapse Yemen. It became Yemen. This land didn't filter history, it absorbed it, preserved it, protected it in strands of DNA more reliable than any written archive. And now, in a time of global identity crisis when borders blur and roots are questioned, Yemen might be the last living mirror of what human origin really looks like. This is not the end of the story, because deep beneath Yemeni soil lies a fragment of DNA no one expected. And it could change everything we think we know about the first humans to walk this earth.